Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. I wanted to talk to you today about another discussion topic from Running Repairs Online, one from Module 3, which is all about gait analysis and retraining. And that's this question: should we actually try and change the way people run? So today I want to give you a little bit of a view on some of the arguments against changing people's running gait and some of the arguments for changing people's running gait. And I'd really like to hear from you. What do you think about it? So let us know in the replies. Do you think we're kind of opening a can of worms, really, fiddling about with people's technique, and that we should leave it alone? Do you think perhaps slightly differently? You think that actually we should spend more time focusing on the technique and skill of running and trying to optimize it for individuals? What experiences have you had with it? Have you had situations where it's really dramatically helped an athlete that you'd like to let us know about? Or maybe the opposite, maybe you've had situations where you found that trying to change someone's running gait has actually made things worse. So I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the replies, in the comments, what do you think? Should we try and change the way people run? Or should we focus on other aspects of care and leave that alone? Okay, so let's start with some of the arguments against changing the way people run with gait retraining. First one is this theory that runners actually self-optimize their running gait over time. And there is some evidence to support this, that as we run, the sensation of effort correlates to some degree with efficiency and the metabolic cost of running. So over thousands of minutes and miles of running, we optimize our gait towards what would naturally be the best gait strategy for us. And there is evidence to show this, that trained runners particularly seem to adapt their running style towards what we might think of as optimal. We see changes in things like stride length and step rate, for example, closer to what we may consider to be optimal. So there is evidence to support that. And if that's the case, if we self-optimize to suit our own personal characteristics, then is it actually going to be helpful to come in and try and change that? Or are we actually upsetting a balance that's been achieved through thousands of hours of running? So that's the first point, certainly one to consider. Second argument against changing the way people run is that it is actually quite hard to reduce load. What we tend to do is move it around. For example, a lot of people have been advised to switch to a forefoot strike. That's very common because it can reduce the load on the knee. And yes, there is evidence to support that. But when you switch to a forefoot strike, we know it also increases the load on the calf and the Achilles. So there is this tendency to actually just shift load to another structure. So are we just creating a problem somewhere else? And we do see that in some of the gait re-education studies, particularly the ones that focus on shifting to forefoot strike. There is often reports of calf pain in those studies, or foot and ankle pain from that change in load. So that's a good second point. Are we actually reducing load? Are we just moving it to somewhere else? And the third point, I think, is an important one, is actually still this quite limited evidence in injured runners particularly. There are quite a number of biomechanical studies largely done on healthy runners that show that we can alter load on tissues, and these are useful, but there are surprisingly few on runners that actually have pain, surprisingly few showing that we can change symptoms through gait retraining. There are some areas that are better studied, like patellofemoral pain. We've got a collection of studies there, but some areas where there's virtually no research, there's very few studies that I'm aware of, for example, in Achilles tendinopathy, or medial tibial stress syndrome, or iliotibial band syndrome. We have maybe a handful of case studies, but no real high quality randomized controlled trials in a number of these regions. So you can see, when we talk about gait analysis, there are certainly some concerns around it here. Three valid reasons why we may not consider it to be the best option, certainly for everyone. So we need to bear those points in mind. So what about the arguments for then? What are the arguments for gait analysis? Because we want to see both sides of this story. Well, there is evidence that our gait analysis and retraining can reduce load on a number of tissues. We've seen that through increases in step rate, reducing load on the patellofemoral joint, the tibia, the Achilles tendon, possibly even the plantar fascia, and a number of other structures. there is some evidence it can improve pain and also may potentially improve running economy. So there's lots of potential benefits from it. You know, if it can reduce pain, reduce load and improve running economy, then that really is a win-win for runners. And actually some of these areas that we might address from an injury point of view seem to overlap with performance and efficiency. For example, overstriding is thought to be inefficient, but it's also thought to increase the load on a number of different tissues. So an increase in step rate might not just help reduce the load on, say, the knee, but it can actually help to improve economy and potentially performance too. So there is an upside here if it's used in the right cases. Also, subtle changes can work. Now, we're not looking at making big changes. In fact, I would advise against making big changes to a runner's gait, because if you're making a big change, you're really likely to be shifting the load somewhere else and maybe creating other issues. And as we touched upon, shifting to forefoot strike when you're normally a heel strike is a good example of that. You're just going to end up shifting the load to the calf and Achilles and potentially creating problems there. But actually in some studies, very small increases in things like step rate can make a difference, even as low as 3% in some cases. Now, typically we might look at an increase in step rate of between 5 and 10% as a way of increasing step rate to address an overstride or perhaps help to reduce some hip adduction during running. So these are quite small changes that runners can often implement quite successfully. So we don't need to make big changes to the way people run, but these small changes have the potential to improve both pain and loading and potentially efficiency as well. So subtlety may be the way to go with this. And then the final point on this is it does seem that our exercises alone don't change our running gait kinematics, so the movement patterns we see during running. Now, it's been a bit of an assumption through the years that if you see a runner who lands and moves into a lot of hip adduction during running, that means that they've got weak glutes, and that if we strengthen their glutes, it will address that problem. But actually, that's not at all supported by the evidence. For a start, we can't look at the way someone runs and judge how weak or strong they are. It simply doesn't work like that. But if we try and strengthen up those glutes, it also doesn't seem to be the case that it changes the way that person runs. Their hip adduction angle will still be very similar. If you want to address that movement pattern, the way to do it is through gait retraining. You're not going to get it through exercise changes alone. So that's quite an important point to take here. And it's a point that's applicable to other complex tasks as well. If you want to improve someone's hopping technique, you have to practice the hopping technique and give them particular cues to help them change it. And we think the same is very much true of running. If you want to change the way someone runs, you have to practice running and use particular cues and instructions to try and change that. So we can see there hopefully both sides of the story. There are some sort of arguments against that we've got to bear in mind, but there are also some good arguments for. And what I think it's about in terms of whether we change someone's running gait is working with each individual and reasoning through how it may be helpful in their case with their injury to achieve their goals. I really want to make sure we're moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach where everyone's pushed towards running forefoot or everyone's pushed towards upping their step rate. What we need to do is work with an athlete and determine whether there's something that's actually going to benefit from gait retraining. So look for anything in their running style that may place extra stress on sensitive tissue and see then if we can change it. And if we do change it and it improves their symptoms and it feels comfortable, for me, that may well show that there's a role for gait retraining for that individual. But also say gait retraining isn't usually our priority intervention. I'm not bringing runners into clinic and immediately whizzing them off to look at them run. First of all, I think we've got to do a good, thorough initial assessment. We've got to help the runner understand their injury and we've got to get their training at the right level. That's absolutely key. That's probably the easiest way you can reduce load on sensitive tissue is alter the training to a manageable level. Secondly, I think we need to make sure that the training's planned right and there's enough recovery in it because that's very important. Thirdly, we need to have the right exercise in there. There's more evidence to support the use of strength and conditioning, for example, for improving running economy than there would be for gait changes. So we get the other priority things in place first, have the runner understand their injury and know how they can manage it, and then typically it might be session 3 or session 4 when we've got those things in place that we might say, right, now's the time we're going to have a look at your gait and see if there's anything we need to change. And if we do change it, it can be subtle but still can be effective. But if we don't need to change it, great. That's also good too. We don't always have to change just for the sake of it. It can be a really good outcome from a gait analysis to say to a runner, your running style is fantastic. We don't need to worry about changing it. Don't change a thing. Let's focus on these other areas. Okay, so that is a few points from me on whether we should change a runner's gait. I'd really love to hear from you. What do you think? Let me know in the replies and comments. I've also included a link to our resource page where we've got a great collection of free webinars on running injuries, so do check those out, and I look forward to reading your replies and comments. Okay, thanks very much. Bye for now.